Hi, everyone. My name is Sunny Heike-Snapton, and I am the NACD Northern Plains Region Representative. Welcome to Grow More, Reaching Beyond the Traditional Agriculture Audience Breakout Session. In this session, you'll hear from Jess Espinchade and Luke Peterson from the National Wildlife Federation. They will discuss the need to understand how people make decisions and identify values as the first step in designing events that people actually want to attend. The session is specifically designed to equip agricultural outreach staff with new strategies and tools to reach beyond the normal field day audience. This will help staff to think through the decision-making processes of farmers and to design conversations and events that better meet farmers where they are in order to help them be more sustainable in the future. I'm very pleased to introduce you to our speakers. Jess Espinchade is the Sustainable Agriculture Program Manager at the National Wildlife Federation. She developed her love of agriculture growing up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Jess manages the Cover Crop Champion Program and Grow More trainings, traveling the country to equip on-the-ground agricultural professionals with the tools to make sustainable agriculture a fit for all farms. Her background includes work with the Pennsylvania Association of Conservation Districts and the USDA in Vermont. Her graduate work focused on human dimensions of natural resources, specifically how people make decisions about the environment. Her current role combines her interest of social science with her desire to promote a more sustainable future for agriculture and the environment. Luke Peterson is the Sustainable Agriculture Program Coordinator at the National Wildlife Federation. Luke provides outreach and message trainings to National Wildlife Federation's cover crop champions and conservation professionals across the Midwest, equipping them with the skills to reach more farmers and increase the adoption of working lands conservation. Luke grew up on a family farm in Michigan, where he developed a drive to inspire stewardship of the land, wildlife, and resources we all depend on. He has a master's degree in ecology from University of California, Davis. He has worked with the USDA NRCS, Blue Point Conservation Service, Science, and local partners to influence and implement conservation efforts on working farms and ranch lands. Before I pass the floor to our speakers, I'd like to remind our audience that the speakers are online to answer your questions during their presentation. So please use the chat box function to provide your questions to them. Jess and Luke, thank you for being with us today. Welcome, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. So as you mentioned, we're really talking about how to reach beyond the choir of agriculture. Not only how do you basically change people's behavior, but more importantly, how do you design your conversations and design your events so that behavior change can actually happen? So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to be the first presenter, so I'm going to speak for about half the time, and then I will change it over to my coworker, Luke. So we're going to go through how people make decisions. How do we as professionals then influence those decisions? Then we're going to go over something called the diffusion of innovation theory, which is much less complex than it actually sounds. And then we're going to go through some actual strategies of how do we reach the non-adopter or somebody who is not using the agriculture practices that we would like them to use. So let's start off by talking about humans. If you walk into a traditional economics class, the professor will probably tell you that people make decisions rationally. So they sit down for every decision and they write out a pro-con list. They think about all of the positives of the decision and they think about all the negatives of the decision. And then if the benefits outweigh the negatives, then that decision is the right one to make. However, the issue with that is not how people make decisions. If we purely went off of a cost-benefit analysis, then things like Weight Watchers wouldn't have to exist because we would always choose the apple instead of the brownie. Things like Black Friday wouldn't exist because people would understand what the limitations of their budget were and they wouldn't go out and buy all of the unnecessary things that are on display on Black Friday, talking from personal experience here. So how do people actually make decisions if it's not purely rational? So we're going to go over some different things. We're going to walk through some beliefs and attitudes, personal experience, emotions, habits, and social norms. So let's talk about beliefs and attitudes first. So this really goes back to how were you raised? What experiences have you had in life? So this can be who your parents were, where you were raised, whether or not certain things were important in your social system or in that you actually build up through high school or college or study abroad. All of these experiences change your value systems and your beliefs and how you approach life. So, personal experience. I'm gonna share some stories here that are kind of generally recognizable. And then as we go through the presentation, we'll make it more concrete to agriculture. So I'm going to use my experience of Brussels sprouts. So as was mentioned in my introduction, I was raised in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. If those don't know what that area looks like, it's a very agricultural area and has a large population of Mennonite and Amish. Well, I was raised Mennonite. So in Mennonite cooking, basically the only way that you season something is adding salt and butter. So as I was being raised, my mom thought it was really important that I was, given fruits and vegetables so that I would have healthy eating habits. And so she's like, what's healthy? Brussels sprouts. So she decided that she was just gonna feed us lots of Brussels sprouts, but she didn't know how to make them. So as in this picture, she boiled them. She boiled them and then she gave them to us and they were disgusting. So all of my life, I was like, Brussels sprouts are gross, just end of story. And so it actually took until I was in grad school and a friend was making Brussels sprouts and they had to really convince me that Brussels sprouts are tasty if prepared in the right way. So she gave me something that looked like this. So actually had some garlic, some other spices. They were baked, not boiled. They used something called oil. And I tried it and it was delicious. And I am now a huge proponent of Brussels sprouts. So what does that silly / simple story tell you? If you have a negative experience of something in life, you are more likely to perceive that as negative in the future. So for cover crops, for example, if you try it and it doesn't work out the first time, less likely to try it in the future. If something went really well the first time you tried it, you're more likely to think of that as positive in the future. So this is true for everything that you experience in life. And so it's really important to keep that in mind as you go through and do outreach and figure out what past experience have been had. So then we have emotions. Emotions are interesting because we're not Spock. We're very emotional beings, and a lot of our decisions are actually made off of gut instincts or emotions. And so as professionals, there are certain emotions that we want to inspire, and there are certain emotions that we want to avoid. And so there are multiple papers on this, but I'm gonna kind of simplify it down. And so some good emotions that we want to inspire are things like pride of being a farmer, pride of farming like your great grandfather did, pride of farming like an Iowan. Another is safety. So people don't really like risky situations. They want to make sure that they are taken care of and that they have financial stability and livelihood stability and that they have something for their kids to take over. And then also contentment. This may seem like super common sense, but people like to feel content where they're at. And so it's really important to actually inspire those emotions when you can. And then there are emotions that we need to avoid. And so this actually gets really tricky because sometimes we want to point out that people's behavior is not ideal. And therefore we try to shame them into changing their behavior or asking them to feel fear of, if you don't change now, look at all the ruin that will come. Or sadness. The example of sadness that I use is like the very old school, like it was Humane Society, like commercial, where it had like all of these really sad kittens in the background, and Sarah McLachlan was singing Angel. And what it showed was that people watched it, they felt sad, and instead of giving money, they actually changed the channel because people don't like feeling sad. And so there are certain areas that where we think it might actually inspire people to behavior change, it actually has people kind of turtle shell effect, where they get down and they're like, I don't want to change anything because I don't want to feel these emotions. And especially shame in our area of work is used a lot. I went to a field day in Ohio, and they were talking about algal blooms. And the one speaker came up to the front and said 80% of like all of the pollution problems that we have are the fault of farmers. And so that immediately turned off all the farmers in the audience, because they're like, hey, we're being blamed for this. It doesn't matter if the statistic is true. It's a way that it's presented to try to shame is actually will have the opposite effect. Another thing that influences behavior change is habits. So whether you exercise every day, you're more likely to continue exercising. If your parents started using cover crops and then you use cover crops, like that most likely will continue. Breaking a habit and starting a new habit is actually really hard. And so keeping that in mind of what they've done every day and what you're asking them to do is a big shift. Then we have social norms. Social norms are something that everyone's aware of, and they're part of our everyday life. This is what is the general populace doing? What is your neighbor doing? What are like people in your area doing on a daily basis? And how does your behavior differ? So one of the things that we talk about in farming is that it's one of the only public performance professions. So what does that mean? That means that everything that they try on their field is out for public display. So everybody driving past can see what they're doing and what they're trying. And so if you're afraid of failure, that's actually a real barrier to entry. So if we can all agree that a lot of things go into decision making, then why is our traditional outreach model if people only knew the facts? A lot of the times when I worked for USDA, when I worked for PACD, when I've worked for other organizations, a lot of us use fact sheets. And that's like a time-honored tradition of putting together a lot of statistics on the page and handing them out at farm shows, ag progress days, whatever it may be. And that used to be my job. And I guarantee you, I handed out all of these fact sheets and they were very nicely folded and then put in the back pocket, and they either ended up in the trash or the washing machine. The issue here is that information alone does not change behavior. They have to have a certain mindset to be open to the new facts or be looking for that information before it actually makes a change. So we need to start changing up our outreach to actually match relevant motivations rather than just handing out facts and hoping people will change accordingly. So we're going to walk through some different behavior change theories. So one is called the self-enhancement bias. So the self-enhancement bias is really people believe that they're better than what they are. So there was a study done that looked at energy consumption. So a company basically went out and they wanted people, their consumers, to use less energy. So they sent out a survey basically asking, how environmentally conscious do you think you are? How much energy do you think that you use? And the answers they got back were kind of staggering, where everyone believed that they were the creme de la creme. So they're like, oh yeah, we're basically environmentalists. We turn off the lights when we leave a room. We turn off the water when we're not using it anymore. Like, if there's a problem with energy consumption, it's not us, it's our neighbors. And they were getting these responses back from everyone, And they're like, okay, if everyone was energy conscious, then we wouldn't be having this problem. And so they actually sent out another survey that had their energy consumption next to their neighbors, their average consumption. And so they had their energy consumption and then said, you're using 73% more than your neighbors. And so that's using that social norm comparison of nobody wants to be the outlier. And so just by doing that, energy consumption actually dropped just by giving that social norm. You don't want to be the odd one out that's using more energy than others. Then we have something called perception filters, which is really complex, but really important. So this is the idea that people have these beliefs and attitudes that they've developed over their entire lives. And so they seek out information that will confirm their pre-existing attitudes. So if they think that cover crops are bad, all you have to Google is like Google all the things that can go wrong with cover crops. And then you look up basically articles that match that internal bias. And so the same science can actually mean different things to different people depending on how it is given. And so we can actually use that to our advantage of changing how things are framed, both in one-on-one conversations, but also in events, so that we make sure that we're matching how people are being, how the information is being perceived to our advantage. Another one is mirroring. This is really important when you're going out and having one-on-one conversations, is that we tend to think that everyone thinks like us. So we're like, oh, we'll go out into the world and we'll use the same information that will convince us to change. So it's basically like going out and expecting to talk to yourself in a mirror. The issue, everyone has different experiences. Everyone has different ways that they were raised. Everyone has different experiences with Brussels sprouts, for example. So rather than thinking that you're talking to yourself in the mirror, you really have to understand where those people are coming from, what their attitudes and beliefs are, before changing how your conversation is framed to best match their motivations. So if we were in person, this would be a very scary activity for everyone, because I would ask everyone to stand up. But as you're listening to this recording, I want you to really think through the answer to this question. So if you're sitting and you have your little office space and you have the conference up on the screen, I asked the question, would you like to change your seat? Would you like to change your spot? And so query theory would suggest that immediately you start thinking of all the reasons why your position is great and why everything else that you can move to is bad. So this is that process of arguing with yourself of like, well, should I move? Should I not move? In my situation, like I made sure that I have a bookcase in the background and that the light isn't blocking anybody. And if I moved to a different area of my house, you would meet my 2 cats and my dog, and the focus would not be on me. So really changing positions is a horrible idea, and remaining exactly where I am is the best. The problem is that this actually happens in a lot of areas of our lives. So this leads to something called the status quo bias, the place that never changes. So it's the idea that people would rather remain the same than change, because change is hard. And so what do you do to actually counteract this pressure to remain the same? There either needs to be a change in social pressure. So there needs to be a change of public policy or what your families or neighbors are doing to actually force you to change, or the change needs to be doubly as beneficial as the status quo, which basically leads to there needs to be more than just a little incentive to change. There needs to be a lot of incentive to change. Next is social pressure. So the example of this that I use is Google back in 2017 decided to do something called Project Sunroof, So Project Sunroof is really the idea that they went around and just put red dots on the top of houses that use solar panels. So this has nothing to do with why, they just put the red dot. But of course, like as most academic institutions do, they want to figure out why. So they went around and actually looked at all of the reasons why some people are using solar panels and others aren't. And so what did they find? Well, at first, nothing. They looked at all of the basic demographics. They looked at gender, they looked at income, they looked at race, they looked at political leanings, and they were just trying to figure out why some people would use cover crops and, some people would use solar panels and others wouldn't. And what they actually figured out is that the only correlation was if you stood in the front of your house, could you see another roof with a solar panel? Because that had normalized it in your mind of solar panels are a normalized thing and this is the way to go. And so how does this relate to agriculture? As I messed up earlier, of if you see other fields with cover crops, then you're more likely to see that as a normal part of society and therefore try it yourself. So many different factors in decision makings. We walk down through values and emotions, social support, how adverse are you to change? So this one's actually really interesting. This is like, do you think that change is exciting? Like, are you the person that goes and stands in line for the new iPhone? Or is change actually really scary where you don't necessarily want to move, you don't necessarily want to change your job because like you like where you're at, but also the idea of trying something new is really risky. And then I don't want to say that all access to information is bad. Like statistics, number statements, all are fantastic things to use. The point that I'm trying to put forth is that there needs to be that underlying like desire for change before that access to information will actually make the difference between perception and behavior change. And then lastly, we have economic return on investment. So economics are always always a part of the picture. They're always a piece of the pie. However, as outreach professionals, we usually think that it's the only factor. And we're like, okay, if the numbers just pan out, then everything is solved. And that's just not true. It's actually to the point of like, as I mentioned with Black Friday, like you're going out and you're buying new things. Like my uncle is a farmer and he absolutely will admit that he'll buy tractors that look cooler that he doesn't necessarily need in that moment and he could be putting that money towards something else. So while you still need to have all the numbers pan out and you need to meet your bottom line, it is not the only reason why you're actually going forward and making decisions. A lot of these other factors of 1 through 4 are actually sometimes more important than the basic economics. So if people are so complicated, how do new ideas become mainstream? How does something come from nobody having a cell phone to everybody having a smartphone? And the answer is different mental models. It's different ways of approaching a decision. So we have something called the diffusion of innovation curve. And it's basically putting people into different categories of how they approach a decision. So this is basically how risk averse are they, or how likely are they to try something first? So if we look at innovators, they're the smallest part of the population, but they're the ones that are going to try something first. They're the ones that are going to run out to their own field and try cover crops, no-till, rotational grazing before any of their neighbors. And then you have the early adopters. So once the innovators have kind of paved the way, early adopters are going to jump on board. But then you have the middle adopters and late adopters. And they're the ones that are actually making up the majority of any population. And they basically have to make sure that everything works out before they're willing to jump on board. And then we have the laggards. This is the group of the population that, like, no matter what you try, they may not jump on board. There are people like my grandfather that until the day he died, he believed that the internet was evil. Like he owned a business, he was a salesman, and he believed that the internet was no use to him, no matter how much I tried. Good news in outreach that if you're trying to increase the amount of people using no-till, you don't necessarily need that 16%. Focus on like the earlier adopters and the middle adopters and the late adopters before you have to worry about that 16%. Because if you get 84% of the population to try anything, you've met your first goal. So why am I here? It's basically the idea that this traditional outreach model is really good, that model of just giving people information is really good at reaching those innovators and early adopters. Like, we're great at reaching them because they're the ones that already want to try something new. They're the ones that are reading the newest research and going out and trying things. We're really great at supporting them. They're the ones that show up at the NRCS office or the Conservation District office. But then we have this chasm where in certain states, we've gone through the innovators and early adopters, like in cover crops, for example, but then it just kind of stalemates and it doesn't really change. More people aren't jumping on board, more people aren't jumping off. But then how do you reach that majority? How do you reach those middle and late adopters? And it's a change in how we do outreach. We have to change from the just giving people information and hoping that they come to us to changing up how we have one-on-one conversations and how we do events. So I want to go down through the different thought processes of innovators and late adopters. We're just going to kind of put them in those two groups. So innovators, early adopters, middle and late adopters. So the innovator early adopters, these are the ones that are more open to new ideas. They're the ones that are really excited about trying something new. They see that as part of farming, for example. Like they always want to kind of be pushing that envelope. They see failure as part of progress. So this means that if something doesn't work out in the first year, that's okay. This is a learning experience. I'm going to learn from it and move on. They also use longer time frames. So that basically means that if the economics don't work out in years 1 through 3, that's okay, because they're going to work out in years 3, 4, and infinity. So they're able to use those longer time frames to evaluate success. And then they don't respond as readily to social pressure. So if everyone in their neighborhood is calling them the oddball and like they're not really going along with what everyone else is doing. They're okay with being out in their field first. They're okay with being out in their field last, of just being able to be that individual rather than part of the group. But then we have the middle to late adopters, and these are the people that we're really trying to reach out to. So they're more uncomfortable with changing the status quo. And again, there is no value judgment here. Like this is not one group is better than the other at anything. It's just how they approach a decision. So they're more comfortable with things remaining traditional. And they can see failure as a stain on their reputation. So if things don't work out the first time, that's actually really scary because they don't want to be seen as a bad farmer. And then they use very short time frames to evaluate success. So if things don't work out in year 1 and 2, they're less likely to try it again in the future. Like if it's one bad experience, why would I try it again? Because they don't want that. They don't see failure as a learning experience, but rather as a reason not to try it again. And then they are concerned with what other people think of them. They do want to be seen as hardworking and a good farmer, just like everyone does. But they're worried that if other people see them as the oddball, that's a negative. That's a impediment to trying something different rather than, I don't care what my neighbors think of me. So we created these clearly very realistic mental model characters. So this goes back to the list of the different groups here. So we have Isaac the innovator, Earl the early adopter, Mary the middle adopter, Larry the late adopter, and Randy the refuser, because I am not a big fan of the word laggard. So what does this mean? Think of these as different people. Think of these as like actual farmers that you would go out and talk to or see at a field day. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk down through some different quotes, and we're going to try to identify who said what. So the things that I want you to keep in mind are like different phrases, like what's their perception of risk? Are they willing to go forth and try something new? Are they more like standoffish until things remain the same? Or are they only citing economics as the reason why they don't want to change? All of these things are things to keep in mind when figuring out somebody's mental model and changing how information is presented. So, going to go down through these. All right, first one is, my father was a farmer and his father before him. Who am I to change how farming has always been done? It's just too risky to change something that's been working for so long. So who said it? All of these quotes, by the way, are actually quotes that have been said at different events or functions. And so, Larry, what does this mean? So Larry, the late adopter, this is the person who is much more traditional. They're thinking about like that things are really risky and that their grandfather did things in a certain way and their father did something in a certain way. Like, I don't want to change things. Now, a lot of the times when I ask this question, people think of this as a Randy, but the problem is that Randy is just somebody who doesn't want to talk to you. This is somebody who's not even interested in the conversation. This is why this is more of a Larry of like, there's that gray area of they're giving you a reason and they're not necessarily going to change right off the bat, but they're giving you that opening. So remember that as we go down through the rest of them. All right, so with the price of corn the way it is, I just can't take the risk of trying something different. So who is it? So they're listing economics as one of the key reasons for why they're not trying something. And I just can't take the risk of trying something different. So again, there's a gray area for this. So if you said Larry or you said Earl, like you're not wrong, but this is the quintessential Mary of like, economics is really important. I can't take the risk of trying something different, but if we figure out ... then maybe I'll try it. All right, farming is always changing. I'm worried that if I don't change now, I'll be behind the times. So again, they're not necessarily the first person to try something, but they are worried about being behind the times. So this is probably an Earl. They're the early adopters. They're not necessarily the first person trying something, but they're not far behind. Do you see the latest research on no-tilling? It's fascinating. I can't wait to see the results on my own field. So what does this mean? They're going out, they're researching themselves, they're figuring it out, and they can't wait to try something new. This is an Isaac right here. This is the innovator. This is the person who's willing to go out and do things. And then lastly, we have, there is no need to change anything. Everything is going perfectly. This is our Randy. This is the person who's not even willing to open up the conversation. And then I have a sixth special one for you to keep in mind before we move on to some of the strategies. There was that farmer, remember, that I told you about back at that field day in Ohio talking about algal blooms. Well, there was this farmer that stood up and was like, basically, why do I need to change my livelihood for PR? This is clearly the fault of factories. It's not the fault of farmers. We don't need to do anything differently. And so if you just heard that quote, you would think Randy. You're like, okay, well, this person clearly can't be worked with. But it was actually, in real life, an Isaac or an Earl, AKA he was doing all of the things that we wanted him to do. He was a cattleman owner, like a cattleman, and he did rotational grazing. He used cover crops, he used no-till, diverse crop rotations, everything that we asked him to do, he was doing. And the thing is that by changing up the emotions in the room changes the tone and actually changes how people are perceived. And so as you're going into one-on-one conversations, as you're going into events, keeping in mind what emotions are heightened and what the framing of the conversation is really important before trying to peg them off of one or two conversations. So this is just supposed to get you to start thinking about how outreach changes based off of mental models. And then I'm going to hand it over to Luke, and he will go through basically some strategies for how you change up your outreach to better reach those middle and late adopters. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jess. And thanks again, NACD, for having us here virtually. Just a quick reminder that since Jess has been talking for the last half an hour or so, she probably hasn't had much time to respond to chat questions. So just keep those questions coming. And then we'll also give a few minutes at the end to follow up on any additional questions you have. So we've just spent the first portion of this session going through really the theory of behavior change. So the why and the how of how individuals and also groups like middle adopter farmers make decisions. So for the rest of the talk now, I'm going to shift from theory to more sort of application. How do we actually use this theory in how we can apply the understanding to real outreach efforts that we do? So whether that's planning events or just having individual conversations with farmers, and then also how we might reframe our messaging to have an impact on our audience in all of these situations. So this section is designed specifically with creating effective messaging at soil health events in mind. So these are events that you will put on during your outreach efforts, but just keep in mind that it can really be applied to really any interaction that we have through the course of our outreach. So that whether these are individual conversations with farmers or producer meetings, or even through your publications and advertisements that you give. Okay, so our objectives here are to first talk through the barriers that we face when we're asking middle adopter producers to consider adopting conservation practices, and also some of the avoidable mistakes that we often make when we're preparing that agenda and message to deliver at our events. And then second, we're going to go over some of the strategies to reframe how we talk about soil health and conservation, and how we can be more effective at both convincing our audience that it's worth doing, but also ensuring that they can actually leave your event ready to make it happen on their own operation. We're also going to have some opportunity to discuss and practice making why statements and also creating exit ramps for change. And I'll go over what both of these concepts mean in a bit. Okay, so to start, let's talk about some of the barriers that we face as outreach professionals in getting middle adopters to change the way they do things. So first is just that new farming practices, whether that's conservation practices or other new technology, are held to higher standards than existing practices. And that really relates to, as humans, our tolerance for risk being lower when we're trying something new. So we and farmers, we tend to go into situations with a current state or way of doing things. And what that causes is it causes us to tend to pre-decide to maintain that status quo. So that can be difficult to overcome and change our decision to instead do something new. So our goal here should be to get our audience to actually pre-decide to change, or at least approach a decision without having already made up their mind about maintaining the status quo. Second, the messages that we use might do a good job at influencing us, but we're a group of soil health promoters or maybe innovative farmers who are already on board with conservation. So our instinct is to try to convince middle adopters to take on that innovator or early adopter mindset or decision-making framework. But that doesn't really work. Instead, we need to understand and work within the middle adopters mindset that we learned about from Jess's presentation just now. And then another mistake that we often default to is not focusing on problems that are relevant and specific enough to your audience. And instead, we tend to just present a laundry list of benefits on doing conservation. And doing this really misses out on connecting farmers to decisions that are going to impact their operation right now. We also tend to assume that our audience has the same background and knowledge about a practice and also unlimited bandwidth or processing power to achieve their end goal of soil health. But we often skip over and miss the diverse places that our audience is likely coming from. And in doing so, we fail to present really clear and uncomplicated next steps that a producer can take when they leave your event. And then lastly, no one likes to admit that they're wrong. So a big mistake that we make is not providing a safe way for a farmer to accept the need to change, but not feel that they were doing something wrong before. Oops. Okay, so considering these barriers when we're messaging to middle adopters, how can we change our approach and make our messaging at events more effective? So this is going to be an overview list here, and then we're going to dive into each of these in more detail in the next slides. So first, we need to provide the right motivation. And Jess talked about this some in her presentation. So we need to focus on the why of trying something new before we get to the what. We also need to make sure that we're using the right language to convey that message and that motivation. We also need to remember to keep the focus on solving resource or operational problems that are really relevant to the audience, but without really drawing attention to the problems with the way that the practices are currently being done. We know that new practices like cover crops are perceived as risky, but what we can do and what we should do is present that risk in the context of other risks that farmers regularly deal with. And then lastly, we also need to make sure that we're providing clear steps that producers can immediately act on when they leave your event. Okay, so first let's talk about motivations a little more. Without the why, the what of whatever you're talking about is just not going to stick. So without a reason to change behavior, very little of your audience is actually going to. So this is why that information deficit model that's characteristic of more traditional outreach is not the best way to approach messaging to the majority of farmers. So conveying information about practices conveys that what, but it misses the why. So at your soil health event, the question that should really be central to your planning and your agenda is that why? So what is the motivation for making the change you're asking your audience to make? Farmers and all of us really are just naturally skeptical or even fearful of changing. So this is a powerful barrier, but we can overcome it by making the motivation to change greater than the fear of changing. So in order to present a motivation that's powerful enough, you really need to know your audience. And this is something that's going to come up throughout our talks today. So why do your farmers do what they do despite how hard of a career it is, right? So are they driven by being out on the land every morning? Do they want to make sure that their kids can go to college? They can afford to send their kids to college. These are just some examples. And I included this photo because you can see a lot of what motivates my dad in this picture here. So he's really proud of the quality of life that his hogs have out on the pasture. He's proud to be able to share that pasture with milkweed that provides habitat for monarch butterflies. And he's also motivated by wanting to leave the land in a healthy state so that my brother and I can inherit it and continue to play a role in managing that land. So all of these are just different motivations that can be valuable to tap into and really get someone to think differently about how they're farming and make a necessary change. One more point here is as natural resource professionals, and I'm sure many of us are scientists, this type of talk and appealing to emotions and personal reasons for doing things can kind of make us uncomfortable because we're often used to thinking in a more objective and impersonal way. So this is just really something we have to get over, because humans are not always objective or rational creatures. So sometimes we have to set our objectivity aside in order to understand and meet our audience where they are. And then the added bonus of thinking like this is that it helps your audience identify better with you, and that can start the very important trust building process, and they'll listen more openly to what you have to say. Okay, so unfortunately with the pre-recorded format of this presentation, we don't get a chance to practice this together and discuss, but I'm just going to give a quick exercise that you can think through now or after you're done listening to us. So what I want you to do is just take a moment to think and develop 2 or 3 of those why statements. So these are, again, motivations that you or someone you work with might have for incorporating conservation practices into a farming operation. And remember that these might be very personal reasons, or they could be motivations that a particular farmer group shares in a local geography or a watershed or something like that. So the more specific and personal the why is, though, the more powerful it tends to be as a motivator. So I'm just going to pause for about 30 seconds here and let people develop a couple why statements. All right, let's move on here now. So another opportunity to meet your audience where they are is in the language that you use to convey your message and those motivations. So we want to try to use terms that help tip the balance in favor of motivations and away from fear of change, right? So some of the words that we want to avoid when we're talking about conservation practices are how innovative or new they are. Words like trial and error or experiment, these both convey that there's a risk to trying them, and they can sort of cast doubt that that practice is actually going to work for me, right? In contrast, though, remember the barrier that we went over that relates to our audience sort of pre-deciding to maintain what they're doing and maintaining that status quo? Well, if we use words like "this is what we do" or "a key part of a management strategy X," these phrases can sort of help break down that sense of not doing anything new being the default option. And instead, it presents the new practice as an equal alternative. And then other language that just helps to convey simplicity and ease relative to the way that the current management is being done is also really effective in changing behavior. Okay, so this next strategy is really simple and intuitive, but it often gets overlooked and left out. So when we're promoting cover crops or other practices, our instinct is to talk about all the great benefits that they can provide for farms and for the environment. So we've got our audience in front of us, and while we have their ear, we really want to try to, not miss out on any opportunity to just tell them everything we know. But it's actually pretty counterproductive to do that. And it's actually much more effective to turn this, I call it an information shotgun approach, into something that's more like a rifle and really target specific on-farm problems that these practices can address. So for example, you might frame your event around ways to address extreme rainfall events, and you can present the soil health practices as solutions to create more resiliency here to these extreme events. Farmers are naturally great problem solvers. That's a major motivation for many farmers. So another benefit of framing these practices as solving problems is that it makes it safe on someone's ego to do something that's essentially challenging their current practices. Solving problems also conveys efficacy in two ways. So first, there's the success of the practice and its ability to solve problems. And then it also conveys the self-efficacy of the farmer. So a more successful operation is defined by having fewer problems. So highlighting those successes is a powerful message to encourage farmer behavior change. So a quick caveat here is that if instead of focusing on solving resource problems, you instead focus on problems with existing practices, you can actually risk a sort of boomerang effect where your audience will double down on the existing practices because they feel the need to put up an emotional self-defense. And that makes sense, but this can easily be avoided by just simply reframing it to talk about new practices solving resource problems. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now. So how do we talk about current practices? So it can honestly be a minefield, and the wrong statement here about a farmer's current situation can immediately turn them off to what you have to say, especially if they sense, a sort of personal attack on the way that they currently farm. Having said that, it's also important to not leave those current or default practices unquestioned, because if we do that, it allows the audience to continue to treat them as different from the new practices. And until we have those current and proposed practices all in the same conversation together, the potential practices are gonna remain more hypothetical, and that's gonna make them easier to just dismiss. So we need to navigate this minefield, but we need to do it carefully. So to do that, we want to be sure to incorporate the strategies that we've already talked about. So using appropriate language and using statements like around here, statements that include the audience instead of setting them apart. We also want to make sure we are focusing on resource problems, not on problems with the current practices. And then we also want to frame the conversation. So by that, I mean, frame the changes that we're asking a farmer to make, as well as the risks associated with them in the right context. So many farmers, you'll hear them say that they like to stick with the tried and true way of doing things. But if we think about it in the context of advances in technology and farming methods, especially over the last century, the truth is there really is no old way of farming. So farming is always evolving, and producers intuitively know that if you don't keep up, you'll get pushed out. So we can play into that. But it's human nature to emphasize the risk of new things and at the same time shrink the risk of existing practices that we've learned to live with, or we think we've learned to live with. Here's a good example of that. So you can see from this table in the bottom right here that a decision on whether or not to use cover crops can impact yield by up to 15%. This seems like a lot at first, but when you put this in the context of the impact that other decisions that farmers have to make regularly, like when to plant the crop or seed selection or other management decisions like that, it doesn't seem as big of a risk to give cover crops a try. So here's another way to think about that. We need to try to not present cover crops as simply to add or not to add. If you present them like that, it removes the consequence of making the no decision. And instead it puts the emphasis on the new risk that's involved in adopting them. So our brains already want to go in that direction. So we need to do our best that we can to counter that instinct. So what we can do instead is talk about the potential outcomes under different management situations. So what does weed control look like in a corn bean rotation versus what does weed control look like in a corn bean cover system? When you frame it like this, it puts the yes and the no decision at the same level. And that just makes it harder to stick to the default. Okay. As outreach professionals, we are very sensitive and conscious about not wanting to oversell whatever it is that we're promoting, right? We're always thinking about how we can be honest and realistic about the risks of trying these practices like cover crops but we also don't want to scare people off. So what this leads to is we often see less than ideal framing come up when we're trying to give disclaimers to our whatever it is we're promoting. So in the interest of not wanting to oversell a practice, we often give a disclaimer with it, like cover crops are an innovative new practice. You might have some failures, but overall it's going to pay off in the end. So this type of statement can immediately cause your audience to cue in on a couple of keywords in here. The first being failure, the failure part of that statement. And they might close the door on you just from seeing that. And it also uses words that we've talked about avoiding, like new and innovative. So instead, if we use a disclaimer like this, if we put our risk of cover crops into context of the risks that come with any other agronomic practice and decision, and say something like, this isn't a guarantee, but really what in farming is. So compared to the risks of not using cover crops, I'll take this any day. If we phrase it like that, it still gives a disclaimer, but it doesn't make it seem like the new practice is the risky choice or the scary choice. Okay. When we ask farmers to change the way that they do things, what we're doing is essentially challenging their past judgment. And as we all know, when we feel judged, it can cause us to put up a wall and not accept advice, even if it's actually really good advice, and we know that. So let's think of conventional agriculture as this 4-lane interstate. And we've got our standard conventional tillage and other practices cruising along at 70 miles an hour. But next to the highway, there's this scenic bypass, and it's got curves and vistas and goes by some national parks. That bypass is more sustainable agriculture. So even if a producer wants to be on that scenic road, if they don't have an exit ramp from the highway, they have no way of safely getting off. They can't just drive through the barrier, right? So in our messaging, we need to be making sure that we are providing that exit ramp. So this means that we should be sure to provide a means for the audience to actually protect their ego for their past refusal to change, or in other words, get off the highway before this moment. In order to do this, the first thing we need to do is acknowledge that there was a legitimate reason for not adopting conservation practices earlier. So maybe your farmers thought that cover crops would lower their yield, or they weren't aware of anybody selling cover crop seed nearby. So you can ask them that. You can say, what gave you the doubt? What has given you the doubt about these practices up till this point? And then the second part of that is that we need to tie these past reasons into a new reason to adopt now. And we do this by noting how things are different now, and that now is a time when it makes sense to change. And so this idea of an exit ramp relates to what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, which is basically just anxiety or stress that's caused by making a decision or having to make a decision that goes against past decisions that we made. And it's especially powerful when our past decisions were actually well-reasoned. So for example, the reasoning, I tilled to warm the soil up in the spring. That's a perfectly legitimate and a good enough reason to think that tillage was the best option. So this cognitive dissonance stress causes people to try to end the cause of that dissonance. And so they'll do this in one of two ways. They'll either revert back to the past choices, and that helps restore consistency, or they'll find a reason to actually justify changing. And so our job as outreach professionals is to guide the audience toward that latter choice of finding a reason to justify the change now. Okay, so we're going to practice again now with exit ramps. So again, I'd like us to all think of and write down, if you want, first, an example of an exit ramp that you might provide to someone who you're trying to convince to try something new. So again, this exit ramp is basically a statement that you could use in a conversation with a farmer that would help protect their ego for not changing in the past. So in other words, an acknowledgement of a legitimate reason for not adopting conservation practices yet. And then along with that, I also want us to think about the second part of the exit ramp, which is basically a good tie-in to a reason for now being the time to change and adopt something new. So what has changed that has sort of broken down that legitimate barrier for not adopting earlier? And I'll pause briefly again here for a few seconds to let you think through this exercise. All right, so I hope everyone had a chance to at least get started on this, and feel free to follow up with it after the presentation as well. So I'll just give one of my own exit ramp examples that I might use just to see if we're kind of all on a similar track. So I might say, I get it. Several years ago, there was a big concern about how we would manage weeds and residues to get fields ready for planting in the spring without tilling first. It was really hard to incorporate cover crops, especially because I already had this no-till operation going on. Now, though, I know that there's actually several farmers in the county who have no-till drills, and they have already offered to help farmers like you who are just starting off with cover crops to lend one out for you to try. So that's sort of broken down that barrier to not being able to try cover crops before. Okay, moving on to one more point here. So at your event, you should assume that everyone in the room is coming from different backgrounds and different levels of experience for each different practice that you're talking about. And what's more is that the research and the recommendations around soil health practices and agronomy are always changing so fast. So you should not assume that your target audience knows even the basics of what the topic is that you're presenting on. And that's really why it's best to start with as big a picture as possible and start with those big picture motivations and goals for using cover crops before you get into the more nitty gritty details of management and other aspects of more sort of technical views on these practices. And if you do that, you will end up not losing anyone who's on the fence about trying this practice right at the beginning of your talk. So presenting in this order also ensures that everyone is on the same page. And for those who are already knowledgeable in the room, don't worry, it's not gonna make them bored or anything like that. It's only gonna serve to reinforce and build confidence in what knowledge they already have on these practices. You also really want to try to present your message in 3 to 5 very concrete and actionable decisions and next steps that the audience can leave feeling ready to get started on. And honestly, if you can't simplify down your message to those 3 to 5 key steps, then you probably shouldn't be even giving the talk, because it's not fair for you or others to expect your audience is going to be able to figure out a specific plan to go enact based on some general benefits and recommendations that you gave. And research actually shows that people who are asked to consider specific decisions and details are about 25% more likely to actually follow through and complete the overall project or goal. So in other words, complication can lead to procrastination, and we want to try to avoid that. And lastly here, just reiterating that confidence or that feeling of self-efficacy and being able to do something is always something you want you to leave your audience with. So it's a big determiner for success. Your audience needs to leave your event believing and knowing that they can take that next step. Okay, so just in summary here, as we're going out and developing goals and an agenda and the messages that we're going to do outreach through at our outreach events, it's important to have in mind both the common mistakes that we often make, and then also how we can overcome barriers that do exist to really make our event stick with our audience and result in them taking action right away to change. So this includes, like I went over, providing the motivation for change. So not simply stating facts and benefits. We want to focus on solving resource or operational problems that are relevant and important to the audience, rather than focusing on either on laundry list of benefits or problems with current practices. We also want to make sure we're putting decisions to adopt conservation practices, and as well as the risks that are associated with them, in the context of how agriculture is always changing and how any management decisions that farmers have to make are always going to involve some level of risk. Remember that we want to make it safe to change by providing that exit ramp, right? And lastly, we should always try to keep the process for changing an operation in this way as simple as possible. So we want to make sure that in our events, we're leaving the audience with 3 to 5 actionable next steps that they can take. And that is all I have. So I think Jess and I will now be available for a few minutes for any outstanding questions in the chat. So thanks for listening in.
Jess and Lou, thank you very much for such an excellent and informative presentation. It was really enlightening. I hope everyone enjoyed this breakout session as much as I did. Please don't forget to return to the meeting agenda and pick out one of the great sessions that you would like to attend next. Thank you so much.